Thank you so much for inviting me and for this really warm welcome and this very generous introduction. I think it's the second time in my life that I'm speaking at midnight, but it's the first time that it's midnight for me and early evening for the people on the other side of the planet. And so I hope that what I will be sharing with you will not sound too midnightly to you, but something like something that is still very much keeping us awake. I will share with you some reflections on architecture situated between the future and also the way in which architectural history and its teaching maybe is in need of change in order to think what architecture can do and what architecture has been doing in the past differently. And I will also share some observations on architecture education, because I think that education is actually maybe not the only, but one of the most important sites through which architecture can be reclaimed, rethought, and brought into the real world differently. And so it's different entry points that I will share with you. It's not one coherent argument from A to Z, but it's a number of observations that I hope will come together to make understood that in a complex world, architecture is located at the interdependency of ecology, economy, labor, humans, non-humans, and what we call the future, but also the past or the legacies that were already invoked when you referenced the consequences of settler colonialism and how this is always an implication to those that are present at later moments in history. So in my part of the world where I grew up, it was the history of genocide and fascism that was the legacy in which people living in Austria, where I live, are implicated in. So it's a different legacy, but this intersection of implication with something that we as living currently have not done, but are sharing a responsibility for, will be part of what I'm thinking about today. I'm sorry, I tried to see my screen, which I want to share with you, but I seem to only see your screen, so I'm a little confused. I'm sorry. Is there something that I need to do differently from the way I do it normally? I'm sorry.
No, I don't think so. So it should work. So with share screen.
Yeah, that's what I do, but I don't see my own screen from which I would open my presentation.
Maybe you go to escape and get out of the full screen mode.
I'm not in full screen mode. I'm really sorry.
Or if it doesn't work, you can email me your presentation and I will advance it.
Let me just try again.
You may have options on your screen that says, after you share a screen, there's in the upper left, usually there's an icon that you would click on. I've been confused by that too.
It looks completely different from what I normally get. So I'm really sorry. After 1.5 years on Zoom. Okay, basic. So can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the patience. So I want to begin with really a very, very basic definition. What is architecture? It's the dictionary definition. It's the art and science of designing and erecting buildings, but it's also buildings and other large structures. So what is interesting about this is that architecture is a noun that refers to an activity, a noun that actually speaks about something we do as architects, namely designing and also erecting buildings, which is normally not what architects do, but in this division of labor, many others actually then do erect buildings, construction workers, and a large number of other people involved. And architecture also means the effect of this design, the buildings and other large structures. And so what I'm puzzled with is that there isn't really, or maybe there was historically, but there isn't now in English or in the language I speak, which is German, a verb for architecture, which would be like to architect or to do architecture. And I think to turn architecture into a verb is part of making architecture a practice that becomes a caretaking practice. So to understand that it is a doing and not just resulting into an object that can be grasped with a noun. Architecture, as has long been understood by scholars in the wake of Michel Foucault, is the built archive of power. But I want to suggest here that architecture is also the built archive of care, in order to introduce that connections between power and care are extremely complex. So on one hand, care gives power, so those who are being cared for, and those who receive care, but also those who are caregivers, are always in relations that, like John Tronto has argued, are shot through with power. But also care is entangled in power relations. So care is not an escape from power. When we think about state care or control through care, then care is very much part of the complexities that have to do with the ways in which bodies can be enabled, but also subjugated, can be empowered, but also controlled or oppressed. And both of these movements have to do with the relation between power and care. So I would say care, just like power, is never innocent. And therefore a claim to care cannot be a promise that things will become better, but a very specific lens, ethically and politically, how emancipatory architectural practice can and will contribute to ecological and social justice is what caring practices in architecture that the exhibition Critical Care assembled tried to posit and make understood. I will now share a number of photographs with you, some of which I have taken myself, and others are documents of artistic performances, in order to speak about very mundane or everyday practices of care that are actually necessary in order to sustain architecture and the environment. so that human and non-human beings can be in these environments. The first images that I share with you were taken this year in July, a Saturday morning in Munich, 24th of July. And I was going for a very early walk there. I attended a conference on gender and architecture. It was actually the very first conference I attended with my physical body in pandemic times. And so I enjoyed being away from my home office and from this being in one place all the time. And when walking around 7:30, I saw this group of people who were cleaning and picking up the garbage in front of a museum. And I started speaking with them, and they are actually employed by one of these global cleaning enterprises. And now with the pandemic conditions, having created the night as a time where people of all ages celebrate in these large green areas, which are there in front of museums, there's a lot more garbage in the morning. So they have to start their cleaning much earlier in order to create a pristine environment for the museum visitors when the museum opens at 10 o'clock. So the activities of care here actually perform that the environment appears to not have been littered. So very often care becomes invisible precisely because of the fact that its only effect is to appear as if nothing has happened before. And this makes very clear that architecture conventionally hasn't been understood as a care practice, because architecture results in physical objects that are very much present, visible, and spatial, whereas care, conventionally understood, are repetitive activities that result in nothing other than maintaining the status quo, we could say. But this is precisely what is needed as a life-making practice, that our life can be continued the day after as it was the day before. So we could say that care actually spends time. And when Angelika Fitz and I started to look at architecture through the lens of care, we tried to understand how architecture, the physical built environment, actually is part of providing care to bodies. So architecture is not only in need of caretaking, understood as cleaning, but also understood as repair or facility management. But it also enables bodies to be sheltered, to have a home, to have a place to work. And the pandemic was mentioned before by Cesare in his introduction. And the pandemic has, of course, made abundantly clear that architecture is part of the care environment through which bodies can live and survive. And its absence is very cruel and is part of what we could call structural carelessness. So we could say that homelessness is a form of structural carelessness. So this was the cleaning up after COVID-19 in Munich, which I documented visually. The second image that I want to share here with you is a very famous image by Canadian photographer Jeff Wall, who in 1999 was invited by the Mies van der Rohe Foundation in Barcelona to realize a project, a photographic project. And he decided to take photographs of the morning cleaning of the pavilion. So this is an iconic architectural object created in 1929 for a World's Fair, which took place despite of economic crisis. And the Mies van der Rohe Pavilion represented Germany at this fair. So we see the iconic Mies van der Rohe architecture here, but also the pavilion itself, which celebrates the materiality of modernity, we could say, steel, glass, marble, but it also celebrates transparency. And transparency, which is widely understood as an ideological expression of modernity, something that renders itself obvious, something that has nothing to hide, actually has a lot to hide because it has to be cleaned all the time. So we can also see here that modern architecture, not just iconic architecture of the late 20th century and 21st century, but also modern architecture was very much an architecture in need of care and maintenance. And Hilary Sample, in her book on maintenance architecture, has written about this. So the person we see in the background is only known by his first name. His name is Alejandro. So in all the writings about this work by Jeff Wall and Jeff Wall's own writings, the cleaner doesn't have a last name. And people without last names are people who are very often not recorded in history. So we could say the caretakers of architecture, the facility managers, the cleaners, regardless of their gender, have not been entered into architectural history, even though they are the ones who have the most intimate knowledge of architecture because they take care of it physically with their hands, day in, day out. And I think this is really something that can lead to other types of knowledge taken into consideration in the future when architects and cleaners might become collaborators in making architecture. The next image I want to share with you in this part of the lecture is a work by Patricia Kerschenhout. She is a Surinamese Dutch artist and feminist visual activist who lives in Amsterdam. And in 2016, she was invited to the Stedelijk Museum to do a performance. And she decided to do a performance in which she appears as a cleanup woman on a Saturday. And she describes this experience. So I have invited her to give a lecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, where I teach. And I've also written about this work. And she describes her experience as one where she has become invisible due to her work. So even friends of hers who were present because they knew that she was going to do a performance that day saw right through her. So this is something about the gaze that has been adopted by people who visit museums. When they look at artworks, they don't look at the labor that is needed in order to keep museums clean. And actually, what is being cleaned are the steps and traces of museum visitors that were there. So we could say the dirt of the museum visitors has to be disappeared. By not acknowledging the dirt that is left behind, it results in this kind of injustice that also disappears those who actually do the cleaning. And this was what her performance was about. But it also was a very profound critique of the injustice of the museum world, where the artworks of mostly white artists are being displayed. And the bodies of, how Patricia Kerschenhout explains it, Black and brown people who are immigrant and diasporic perform the labor of cleaning. And this is what her performance addressed. It was also a reference to a very famous feminist artwork that was performed in the United States of America by Merle Eucalyptus Lederman, Hartford Washing Tracks, which is a piece that took place on a Sunday in 1973, and were the very beginnings of Lederman's long-term engagement with maintenance that was honored in a large-scale exhibition at the Queen's Museum just recently began. So Lederman tried to expose that female artists were actually prevented from doing art because they had to take care of their families, of their children, of their homes. And so she declared that her artistic work was maintenance, and she would bring this work to the museum and make it visible there. So in a way, Kerschenhout created an homage to this, but also tried to expand the work to make it a contemporary criticism of the museum world today. And I think what is of interest in our context here is what is being cleaned are museum buildings that are very much in need of constant cleaning because they have to appear unchanged and permanently the same when they are welcoming visitors, so that they can create these spaces where art, which is considered separate from life in the Western understanding of art, is being shown. When we think about what architecture, which is a noun, actually builds, I think it's important, and we all know that. I mean, it's just I just try to remember that. It's not anything that is new. It's just something that is in need of not being forgotten. That architecture builds more than buildings. That architecture builds structures of support, enablement, and care. But architecture also builds structures of domination, representation, and control. And maybe the latter has been more important to those in power who have historically been the rulers, or those who have historically and currently been the so-called 1%, who also use architecture not just for their personal care and comfort, but also for representational purposes of making understood that they have architecture to show that they are in command. And I think we also very critically need to ask of architecture the questions that are hard to answer and often painful when they're being asked to practicing architects. Which systems has architecture built? Which realities under the conditions of these systems has architecture built? So when I think about my own country, where I live in Vienna, of architects practicing in the 20th century, they have practiced for all the regimes in my country. So they might have started out and built for so-called Red Vienna, which was at the beginning of the 20th century. And then they might have built under the Nazi regime. And then they might have built after 1945. And it was the same architects building different buildings for different regimes. And I think it's very important to understand that architecture is essential to systems. In my part of the world, care under COVID conditions has been called essential labor. And I think architecture can actually be understood as essential to building systems and to keeping them alive. But it's also essential to understand that generations after the demise of systems are inhabiting these legacies, and that architecture is not fully defined by the systems for which they built, but that those who use and inhabit architecture can actually inhabit and use them maybe against the original purposes and also against the intent of the systems under which they have been built. So I'm trying to say that architecture doesn't determine what inhabitants and users do inside architecture, but that it is important to understand what the legacies are. And so architecture, as we all know, has built capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, and so on and so forth. And architecture has been built on exploitation and extraction. And so practicing architecture with care or less carelessly has a lot to do with questions of the future, to which I will come a bit later in my lecture. I now want to go to a certain moment in time where it has become very clear that if humans continue to treat the planet the way in which the planet has been treated for the last centuries, the future is very, very uncertain. And the image you see here was taken during the 2015 UN Climate Change Conference, the COP21. And there had been many marches planned for the climate conference to take place concurrently, but they had to be canceled because of the terrorist attacks that had happened a couple of weeks before the climate conference. And therefore, Paris had, France had imposed a state of exception. And then the activists came up with the idea of assembling shoes on the Place de la République. And this image was very important for Angelika and myself when we started to think about care and architecture, because it's an image that cuts through impossibility. So there was the confluence of terror and the state of exception that made it impossible to gather physically. But what was being gathered were those parts that normally are on the feet of bodies and actually are the connection between the ground and human beings, namely shoes. And the shoes stand in for the bodies. And what I like so much about this is that when we think about all the things that have to come together here, so the workers that clean the Place de la République every day, and historically all the workers that have set the stones here, but also all the activists who actually took their shoes to the post office so that they were mailed to Paris and then set them up here. We can see a chain of interdependencies connecting and working together, that something very complex happened, that happened even though it was very unlikely. And so I read this image as an image of hope, that even though it is quite unlikely that we as humans will meet the climate goals in 2030, maybe there will be the ingenuity and the collaboration and the working together that it can happen, even though it doesn't appear to be very likely at this moment in time. And I think that the current day climate activism, of which architecture can become part as a long-term expression of climate care and climate activism, has to do with the fact that the building of the Anthropocene is very much connected to the historical responsibility of architecture having been part of building the conditions of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is the term that was introduced in the year 2000 by Crutzen and Stürmer in order to speak about the anthropogenic conditions created by industrialization since the 1780s. And the Anthropocene is a way of capturing the fact that human beings have become a geological force, and that industrialization has proved much more deadly to life on Earth than its engineers and designers ever have dreamt, as Anna Tsing has written and stated. And the implications of architecture's implicatedness is where I see the responsibility of architecture and its practice today. The next 4 things that I have written down here are, in a way, a very broad conceptualization what came together in this late 18th century that produced not only the modern way of thinking, but also the modern systematic education of architecture. So all this happened at the same time in the 1780s. It was a very formative period for the formation of the Anthropocene, the birth of Enlightenment man, the modern architect with its systematic education that was introduced in France, the notion of human exceptionalism, that human beings are not part of nature, but actually separate from nature and can therefore dominate over nature. And also we could say that human exceptionalism is the idea that is the foundation for what became capitalist colonial extractivism, but also certain regimes of thinking that those who are closer to nature, those who are not part of white supremacy, could be made to be the ones who actually perform the extraction, but also the caretaking. And what the last line here is the death of nature. This is a title of a book by Caroline Merchant, which she has written in 1980, and which is only currently being reread or rediscovered, in which it describes that the 17th and 18th centuries were actually the time in which the modern ways of thinking were established that led to certain ways of engaging with nature as rendering it dead in order to make it more exploitable and more useful to an ever more expansive lifestyle of human beings. And in light of the legacies of the Anthropocene, of which architecture very much forms a part, I think that the history of architecture needs to be studied and taught in architecture schools in a different way, that it can no longer only be a question of style, and it can also not only be a history of masters and mistresses, but it needs to become a more complex history of entanglements with nature, extraction, materials, to understand that each building is a site through which anthropogenic conditions run. Therefore, the history of architecture has to be understood materially and ecologically. And we could ask, how much energy has this building used since 1820 or 1910 or 1940? How much water was needed to build it, and also how much water was needed to clean it? How much raw material has gone into it, and how much labor was invested for its construction, but also for its maintenance and care? And when one raises these questions, one also sees that it's quite impossible to research this, that there is no evidentiary documentation or materials where we could actually find this out for one building, let alone for all buildings. And I think the lack of documentation and the lack of knowledge on this actually shows how careless humans have acted with their architecture and their environment, as if there were no limits to building and no limits to growth. Today, the UN Environment Programme also issues a global status report for buildings and construction, which in 2021 is in its sixth edition. And the 2021 report hasn't been published yet, so I'm referring to the 2021. So today there is an attempt to aggregate data on that, not in the complexity that I talked about. So it's not about how much water and energy is actually consumed for the maintenance and cleaning and repair of buildings, but for their construction. So this is a reference document of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. You can find it online. And it gives, as they state, an annual snapshot of the progress of the buildings and construction sector globally towards the achievement of the goals of the Paris Agreement, of which I showed you these shoes assembled on the Place de la République before, on climate change, particularly on the drivers of CO2 emissions and energy demand globally, and the status of policies, finance, technologies, and solutions that support a zero emission, efficient, and resilient buildings and construction sector. So the goal is to keep the construction sector contained in such a way that it doesn't worsen the conditions that would lead to a tipping point. In the 2020 report, and you find the website underneath, they state that with the inclusion of emissions from the buildings construction industry, the share increases to 38% of total global energy-related CO2 emissions. So the construction sector, of which architecture with capital A forms a part, is actually 38% of the total global energy-related CO2 emissions. So that's a very high percentage for which the construction sector is responsible. And I think, or I strongly believe, that telling the history, and I understand history to reach up to the present. So history is also what happened yesterday. Telling the history of architecture differently will help envision a different future for architecture. As long as practice is understood to construct and theories held to deconstruct, they are not seen as fully mutual supportive to each other. So what I'm suggesting here is that architectural history has to become actively part of making and practicing architecture differently, so that this gap between theory and practice that still very often is part of architectural education, but also the way in which practicing architects understand theory is very much a gap that doesn't allow for active knowledges to actually come together in order to work more constructively for futures that are less toxic. And I would say that these borders between theory and practice that I tried to outline in a very brief way here are borders that actually run through buildings. So if it were better understood materially and ecologically what buildings do to the environment and what they provide for humans, then buildings can be thought, designed, and made differently. Architecture, as is very well known, is a practice that needs many different disciplines, maybe too many to be packed into one study program. So the big question today is how to practice architecture as a practice that needs these many different ways of knowing and these many different types of knowledge. And one question that I particularly have is how will the knowledge of care enter into the knowledges understood as essential to architecture? And this goes back to the images that I showed at the very beginning. How does the knowledge of actual caretakers who intimately know architecture and understand how it works, how it performs, what it needs, actually enter into design processes and be understood as essential knowledge? Architecture is maybe best understood through an approach based on the idea of ecologies. And ecologies are systems of relationships based on the interdependencies of living and non-living entities. So that's the dictionary definitions, that ecologies are these systems of relationships that are based on the interdependencies of living and non-living entities. Caring architecture in this interdependency of living and non-living beings, or architecting care, can be understood through a quote by Joan Tronto and Berenice Fisher from 1990. They wrote that on the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a specious activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so we can live as well as possible. And then the two authors write that world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. They didn't think about architecture when they wrote this, but the second part of their definition, that world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, to me is actually a definition of caring architecture or architecting care, because architecture precisely is the interdependence of bodies and environment, and makes the connection between bodies and the environment in the most complex ways, and therefore dramatically contributes to the way in which planetary care can be provided or not. When we think about architecture and ecologies of care and the realities of interdependency, I think that the framework that was provided by Joan Tronto to think about the different stages of care, which she used as a description, can also be used not only as an analytic, but also as a design tool. So first to ask, what is it that an architectural building cares about? And what do architects, when they design, care about? What do they want to care for? And what does an existing building care for? And how does the care giving and care receiving take place through this building? And how can care with, or caring with, as Tronto describes as a democratic ideal, actually take place between living, non-living, material and immaterial interdependencies? I'm not sure how we are doing on time, so I still have examples, but I think we might also, for the sake of a conversation, not spend, so maybe if I take 5 more minutes. So what I want to share with you is a project by Yasmin Lari, a long-term project, which to me is one of the important examples how caring architecture can be understood. Larry initiated the zero carbon movement in architecture. She is a Pakistani architect who is now 82 years old and who really in her life made a decision. So she describes it that she was a modern architect who built for the 1% of her country, for the elite. And then she decided to no longer build brutalist modernity. She did beautiful buildings. And now she does beautiful zero carbon buildings. And after the 2005 flood, she decided that she wanted to bring her expertise and her knowledge as an architect to the poorest of the poor and enable a large-scale self-building movement that is also zero-carbon architecture. And I will show a few images of the Sin Flood Rehabilitation Project that works with lime, clay, mud, and bamboo, all locally resourced, and has created tutorials so that local people, mostly also women, have become knowledgeable in traditional building techniques to build their own houses after the flood, to rebuild, but to also build houses that will be flood resistant in the future. So it's not only post-disaster care, but also pre-disaster care. And in COVID times, we very much learned about the term preparedness as one of the key terms. So we need to be prepared for the future. And I think this is something that Yasmin Lari very much does. She enables preparedness. This is the Women's Center that is part of the Sin Flood Rehabilitation Project, which was made in such a way that the flood, when it's raising, doesn't reach the upper level where seeds can also be stored. This image shows teaching. So she founded BASA, the Barefoot Entrepreneurs. It's a system where people can teach each other, but also learn how to make building materials like bricks out of mud in order to create circular models of economies and village societies where the poor create a market with and for the poor, as she describes it. And she stated that this program has built 40,000 shelters, no carbon emissions, no trees felled, 1,700 villages covered, 300,000 persons housed. And the materials are locally sourced clay, low energy lime, and renewable bamboo. And this is an image of Yasmin Lari that was taken yesterday. So I went to Milano to be part of the Honorary Doctorate, which she was awarded by the Politecnico di Milano. And it was a very moving and very touching ceremony. And I was very honored that I was allowed to be part of it. And so I wanted to share my joy and show this image to you. Architecture, modern architecture was based on the promise or premise of building a better future. And today we live in the ruins of this promise. We live in times of ruination and conditions of anthropogenic catastrophe during the ongoing 6th mass extinction. So when we think about interdependency and care, we need to ask, which homes will we survive in? Which environments will we survive in? And which homes and which environments will architecture create so that there can be survival? And so the question will be, how will architecture work for building futurity? So not just for something that is there in the future, but futurity in the meaning of making a future possible. understanding that as part of planetary responsibility, to borrow from Donna Haraway, becoming able to respond to planetary demands and also to the demands of futurity.
Thank you, Elke. This was wonderful. Very thought-provoking lecture. Perhaps I may start with the first question, and I want to let everybody know, if you have questions, you can either paste it in the chat or actually unmute yourself and ask it directly. I was especially taken with an argument that you made toward the beginning of the lecture, where you had this juxtaposition of these two sentences: architecture as the built archive of power, and architecture as the built archive of care. So the one sort of the first, so following Foucault, and the second your own one. I think that I'm very taken with that relation or dialectic. I'm not sure exactly what kind of relation there is between power and care. So in a sense, or perhaps I have a too simplistic, let's say, notion of care. But in particular, so the way you follow through on that analysis, and when you said that that care is not necessarily an escape from power, or that care somewhat is also already entangled with power. And perhaps I would like you to elaborate perhaps on that, on that idea that care is not innocent.
Thank you for this really difficult question. So I think there are ways of understanding care in a very narrow way, or a narrower way. To say care is what feminist Marxists called reproductive labor, and it's everything to do with cleaning, food production, restoring and regenerating bodies, and what has also been called maybe housework. And so in this understanding, we could say, when we look at architecture, architecture is a built archive of care, because then we can understand how reproductive labor was being organized and what kind of reproductive labor was required by specific spaces or places. So that could be one way of looking at it. But I think that care has to be understood in different ways and also on different levels. So when we think about the relationship of the state to care, or what we could call state care at different moments in time, how care was being organized by the modern state in the 19th century, the modern colonial state, how care is being organized today, how care was being organized by the welfare state, then we will see that relations between prisons and hospitals that Foucault actually looked at, but never looked at from the perspective of care. How were the bodies actually taken care of in these architectures, and how is care shot through with power? Then I think the understanding of care becomes much more complicated and much more complex. And to understand that resisting certain building commissions could be something that architects actually need to learn. So to say we are not building these buildings because they are actually not buildings that can provide good care. I think your question is so complex, and I'm not sure I can do a good job answering it. It's more thinking out loud than anything else.
May I ask a question? I don't know, Marta, you were unmuted, so did you want to ask a question?
No, please go ahead. I'm listening.
So Elke, I mean, I think that was from Cesare, a difficult question and a great answer from you. And this kind of constant intertwining of power and care, and lack of separation between the two. I'm also wondering, however, in your narrative, when you end with Yasmin Lari's project, there's, you know, I was just wondering if you could also, maybe this was cut out of your talk because of time, but in the presentation, you went through these different historical moments coming to the present with the crisis of climate change and of the Anthropocene. And in that framework, you spoke about, you had this wonderful way of situating how architecture, or, you know, of asking these questions of architecture, you know, what do buildings care about, right? How do buildings care, etc. So that of course, you know, is something that I'm sure that will crop up in teaching in the future. These wonderful questions that we need to look at the built environment and ask these questions. I was wondering, however, if there were examples in the European and North American context where, you know, these notions about care have been, in some sense, fobbed off to a set of standards such as LEED and, you know, green buildings and green architecture, etc. And we know, I mean, there are terms like greenwashing, etc. But, you know, in the sense, they make a gesture towards caring precisely for those things that you know, that we know to be problematic, that we know to be urgencies of the present, right? As Foucault would say. I was wondering if, however, are there examples that you have come across and can point to that are outside of the global South, where, you know, this kind of work has been part and parcel of kinds of ways in which people have dealt with extremely harsh conditions and hostile environments, people of all different, you know, classes and positions, but just in the context of, you know, is there something outside of that framework that you could point to that you think is, in some sense, gestures to these acts of caring?
This is really an excellent question. So I think on one hand you were stating that the globalized construction industry actually very much profits from what is called green construction. So all the parameters that are being set are actually benefiting the insulation industry, or certain notions that then prevent other types of buildings as being understood sustainable architecture. So by narrowing sustainability to something that is actually beneficial to the construction lobby, all other types of sustainability are minor or marginal or not the real thing. In terms of caring architecture, I think there are many examples of caring architecture in all parts of the world. And I wouldn't say that they can only be of one material. So one example that we had included in the critical care exhibition that actually worked with concrete was the Lacaton Basal example from Bordeaux, where they retrofitted 530 dwellings by adding cement prefabricated elements that are types of winter gardens. And it's one of the examples that I was thinking a lot about during the pandemic, because during the pandemic, when people were in their home office, these winter gardens were turned into sites of work and provided much needed extra space. And I think the way in which trying to minimize the footprint, working with the existing. So for me, the most important thing, and maybe I didn't really make that clear enough in the lecture, is that working with what is there is maybe what caring architecture or architecting care can learn from care practices, because the daily cleaning needs to start from the given, and starting from the given and extending it into a possible future is the most basic definition of caring architecture in my understanding. And so I think there are many examples in the global north, building and rebuilding, retrofitting, incremental care practices of not letting buildings fall apart. So we could say, once we have put on once we have taken this perspective to look at buildings, how they are being cared for, both by architects and non-architects, then we can see a lot of caring architecture that does precisely that. And I think what is very much needed for teaching is more examples of that. So the Instagrammable architecture is very often based on something that looks sexy on Instagram, that can be circulated easily. And very often caring architecture is maybe less visibly appealing at first glance. And so I guess what is really needed is, or something that I would like to work on more, is a visual inventory of precisely what you were asking for, many more examples than the one that Angelika and I brought together in the exhibition.
Thank you, Elke.
So I just would add, Elke, to your comment that there are 3 people on the faculty of the architecture school here at City College, June Williamson, Nandini Bakshi, and myself, who've worked very hard at creating that archive. So in the north. So there are, I mean, the book I wrote on Oakland, the book that Nandini has written on New York, and the books that June has written on suburbs are all based on the ideas of retrofitting, repurposing, incremental construction as critical components of making architecture, and certainly in my case, ways of making architecture that are deeply rooted in feminist and caregiving practices. So your talk resonates in so many ways with the work that's happening at our school, and that's wonderful, so wonderful to understand and to hear. I'm a very big fan of Joan Tronto's work and also of Carolyn Merchant's. And so, but when I know for me, when I read her work, my way of seeing the world changed. And what I wondered, what I was thinking of is, or wondered if you had any thoughts on, is I learned to see understand dependency in a new way, in looking from her work on the politics of caregiving. And I wondered if you had any thoughts to offer on the ways in which she flips, we so value independence from Aristotle on, right, as the sort of the character of the setting the character of the democratic citizen. And yet Toronto argues that we lose so much from doing that. And when we, the lights just went out in my office, sorry, but when we flip to thinking of dependency as essential to human life and as something to value, right? How do we apply that to architecture, right?
Thank you for this really, really wonderful question, and thank you also for sharing all the work that your school does. That there is so much there already that resists this hegemonic paradigm of developer-centric architecture. I think one word that I've recently been thinking about a lot is the word ecology. Which has this Greek root of the oikos, which refers to the way in which the household was organized in the Greek polis. And the oikos was both everything that was done in the home, you could say, but also the subsistence agriculture, so taking care of the animals and the fields. And so on one hand, I think it's really interesting to understand that the relationship to nature was always already mediated through householding activities, so that it was always already human-made. But now I'm coming to your question of autonomy and independence. So I mean, what Toronto always describes is that those in the Greek polis who were free to participate in political life were the ones that were sustained by the oikos. So the slaves and the women who had to perform all the labor in order to make some independent, who were actually fully dependent upon them, whereas the ones who had to perform the labor for those who were then independent were not accepted as fully political beings. And I think this is really crucial to understand the inequity or the inherited injustices that have become part of so many political and economic structures trends historically. So I think this is one of the things that I really learned from reading Toronto. And the other thing is that vis-a-vis architecture, the creation of the modern architect as an autonomous creator in the late 18th century, who is placed above all the others in the creation of an individually authored work, which not only proves genius, independent creation, as if the creation were not influenced by inspiration of others, but also makes the product, the result of the design, which in and of itself is understood to be independent and an expression of an independent genius, but also the result, the built object, is then understood as autonomous, I think. And I think this is one of the really complex legacies of modernity, that both the architect was understood as an independent creator, but also that the object of architecture was understood as an isolated, independent object, rather than understanding it in infrastructural ecology that stretches from the extraction of the materials needed to all the hands needed to maintain it. And I think these legacies are the ones that have actually become like running on steroids during the period of iconic architectural production. And so in a way, the end of the Star Architect is maybe the opening of a different future where the built architectural object can be understood as interdependent from the onset on.
Great, wonderful, thank you.
I read a question in the chat, and I'm not sure I fully understand it. So what are the considerations for architectures of care vis-a-vis the public realm? That is to say, I think architecture beyond buildings, private clients, or determined programs. Maybe I could ask Lindsay Harkima to elaborate a bit more, because I'm not sure I can answer.
Sure. Thank you so much for the lecture. I'm a faculty member and currently teaching a unit that's focused on the public realm. Many of the students are in attendance. And we're working on thinking through ideas for architectures that better support the sort of diverse population that uses the public realm. And our particular focus has to do with neurodiversity, but we also think more generally about how the public realm has typically excluded marginalized populations, including those with physical and intellectual disabilities, people of color, women. And so we see it as an exciting kind of jumping off point to actually really rethink the public realm. But I was just curious to hear some of the ideas that you might have about considerations for that space as opposed to a discrete building or a specific program.
Can I ask you to explain to me what exactly you mean by the public realm? Because this is such a wide and broad concept. So do you mean public parks or public outdoor spaces or public indoor spaces?
Sure. Since we're here in New York, we're actually looking at a number of typologies within that, which includes plazas and parks, but also streets, also temporary public spaces and even infrastructures. Also thinking of some indoor spaces like some privately owned public spaces. So that it's true that the public realm encompasses many spaces that typically have some kind of grayness to them in terms of who owns them, who operates them, etc. There might be design standards or regulations in place, but then they are, executed by someone else, and then they are used by someone else.
I think maybe I can answer with an example. I also put it in the chat. Mycket is a Swedish queer feminist architecture collective, and they have been working for the public realm in the context of the Nordic, what's left of the Nordic welfare state in Sweden. And they started to work with a group of dancers who work with all kinds of differently able-bodied bodies. And they have like all different age groups, from very young to very old. And so they together with the dancers, they developed a very specific public infrastructure where they can actually dance. And they were often met with a kind of critique that how can you work with this specific small group of people who have very specific and very particular needs. And the outcome actually was that what they designed for and with this specific group, and the emphasis is on with, actually has become an enabling environment for the community at large who lives there. So I think the answer I would like to give is that the so-called neutral subject that has been abstracted from all other subjects is maybe not the best template in order to create enabling or supportive environments. I think that's one way of thinking about it. And the other way of thinking about it is, I think, what can architecture do to make the environment, the local environment, better? I mean, like the microclimate, if you will, the air one breathes in, the way one can connect to the ground. I mean, so when we think about Latour's, Bruno Latour's critical zone, that is this really small zone that we inhabit as human beings. And we could say, if we think the critical zone as a public realm, very specifically, what can architecture do to make the microclimate better? So I think these are ways maybe I would respond to this, but it's a super complex question. So again, a whole semester program.
Yeah, we have a whole year.
Okay.
So that's good. But this example you gave is excellent. I just pulled it up in the other window and it's beautiful. And in a way it suggests to me, and I say this because I'm working on this kind of work in my independent practice as well, which is collaborative and feminist. This seems like the opportunity to introduce the kind of expressive and really quite formally driven design ideas, because it's all about texture, material, color, experiential form, and joy. So in a way, I feel that this kind of architecture of care is not, a less visually stimulating or less experientially stimulating. It's the opposite, right? And so it becomes a much more compelling, built environment through the lens of care and support. And in this case, for a very specific audience, right? But then it's beneficial to everybody. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.